For 23 years, an abandoned well stood in complete silence. No one went near it. No one spoke about it. The villagers believed whatever had happened there had died with the woman who threw herself into its darkness. Then, just days before a young man's wedding, the well began making sounds again. First whispering, then scratching. Then voices calling someone by name. The villagers said it wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. And it certainly wasn't their imagination, because 23 years earlier, on one of the holiest days in Serbian tradition, a heartbroken woman stood before an entire village, placed a curse on the man who betrayed her, and jumped into that very well. What happened next destroyed 2 generations of one family and left an entire village convinced that some curses never die. My great-grandfather used to tell this story only after sunset, never during the day, never in front of children. Whenever someone asked him whether it had really happened, he always gave the same answer. I don't know, but I know what I saw. The case took place in a small Serbian village near the town of Negotin. Almost nobody remembers its old name anymore, but the oldest residents still do. Once, it was called Zlokuće, roughly translated, the place of evil. Some dismissed it as folklore. Others insisted that villages earn names like that for a reason. My great-grandfather's name was Mihajlo. He lived there his entire life. His older brother, Branko, was the kind of man everyone noticed the moment he entered a room. Confident, handsome, quick with a smile. Women admired him. Men wanted to be like him. He understood the effect he had on people, and he enjoyed it. Branko rarely stayed in one place for long. He flirted. He made promises. He knew exactly what people wanted to hear. Sometimes those promises lasted a week, sometimes a month, almost never longer. Eventually, he always walked away. Most of the women he left behind eventually moved on. Some married, some left the village. Life continued. Except for one. Her name was Vukosava. She lived with her widowed mother and 3 sisters on the opposite side of the village. Her father had died years earlier. The family had very little. Yet no one pitied them. They worked hard, kept to themselves, and Vukosava was impossible not to notice. She had long black hair, pale skin, striking green eyes. People often struggled to describe them, not because of their color, because of the feeling they left behind. There was sadness in them, but also something strangely unsettling, as though she always knew more than she ever said. Despite the whispers, everyone agreed on one thing. She was beautiful. Branko noticed her almost immediately. What began as casual conversations soon became secret meetings. Always after dark, always away from the village. Sometimes near the forest, sometimes beside an abandoned orchard, and very often near the old stone well at the edge of the fields. It had already been there for generations. No one knew exactly who had built it. Its stones were worn smooth by time. The water was unusually deep. Even during the hottest summers, the inside of the well remained ice cold. Children were warned never to play near it, not because anyone believed it was haunted, simply because it was dangerous. At least, that was the explanation adults gave. For nearly 3 years, Branko and Vukosava met there in secret. She believed they were building a future together. She dreamed about marriage, about children, about growing old in the same house. Branko never corrected her. He never promised marriage directly, but he never denied it either. Sometimes silence can be the cruelest lie. As the years passed, the entire village quietly assumed they would eventually marry. Even Mihajlo believed it. Whenever Branko returned home late at night, Smiling to himself, his younger brother would joke, "So, when are you finally going to make an honest woman out of her?" Branko always laughed. "There's plenty of time." Looking back, those words never left Mihajlo's memory, because time was exactly what none of them had. Then, in the summer of 1927, everything changed, without warning, without explanation. One evening, Branko walked into the family home during dinner. He looked unusually cheerful. "I have something to tell everyone." The room fell silent. He smiled. "I'm getting married." For a brief moment, everyone at the table smiled back. The answer seemed obvious. Mihajlo even laughed. "Well, it's about time." Branko nodded, then calmly spoke a name that nobody in the room had ever expected to hear. "Snezhana." The laughter stopped instantly. No one asked who she was. No one needed to, because everyone already knew. She wasn't Vukosava. And before anyone could say another word, Branko quietly added something that made the silence even heavier. "The wedding will be on Vidovdan." The announcement spread through the village faster than anyone expected. By the following morning, everyone knew Branko was getting married. What nobody understood was to whom. People whispered outside the bakery, at the village well, inside the church courtyard. One question echoed everywhere. What about Vukosava? No one had seen her since the news broke. Not once. Not even her sisters knew where she had gone. Some believed she had already left the village. Others claimed she had locked herself inside the family home. No one knew the truth. Only Branko remained strangely calm, almost relieved. Whenever someone mentioned her name, he simply shrugged. It was never serious. Those 4 words spread almost as quickly as the wedding announcement. It was never serious. For Branko, perhaps it wasn't. For Vukosava, it had been her entire future. My great-grandfather would later say that was the first time he truly saw shame on his brother's face. Not because Branko admitted what he had done, because he refused to. Every conversation ended the same way. "I don't owe anyone an explanation." Life inside the village continued as preparations for the wedding accelerated. Tables were built from heavy oak planks. Barrels of homemade wine arrived one after another. Women baked bread throughout the night. Musicians were hired from a neighboring village. Children ran through the dusty streets pretending they were part of the celebration. Everything looked exactly as a village wedding should, everything, except the silence surrounding one person. 3 days before the ceremony, Mihajlo finally decided to visit Vukosava's family. He found her mother sitting alone outside their small stone house. She looked exhausted, older than he remembered. When he asked whether Vukosava was home, the woman lowered her eyes. "She doesn't speak anymore." Mihajlo frowned. "What do you mean?" "Since she heard the news. She barely eats. She barely sleeps. Sometimes she just sits by the window until morning." A long silence followed. Then the old woman quietly added, "She still believes he'll come." Those words stayed with Mihajlo for the rest of his life, because deep inside, he already knew Branko never would. The wedding day arrived. Vidovdan, one of the most sacred days in Serbian tradition. For generations, people believed promises made on that day carried unusual weight. Some called it superstition, others called it respect. Either way, very few people were willing to tempt fate. The morning was unlike anything the villagers could remember. The heat arrived before sunrise. By noon, the air had become almost impossible to breathe. Not a single cloud crossed the sky. The trees stood perfectly still. Even the birds seemed strangely quiet. Old villagers exchanged uneasy glances. "This heat isn't normal." One elderly man crossed himself before entering Branko's yard. "I don't like this." The celebration began anyway. Music filled the courtyard. People danced. Children laughed. Wine flowed freely. For a little while, the tension seemed to disappear. Even Mihajlo began convincing himself that perhaps everything would pass peacefully after all. Then, the musicians stopped playing. Not because someone asked them to, because every person in the courtyard had turned toward the front gate. A woman had just entered. She walked slowly, without hesitation, without looking left or right. Her black dress was covered in dust from the road. Her long hair hung loose across her shoulders. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fixed on only one person, Branko. No one tried to stop her. The crowd simply moved aside, creating a narrow path that led directly toward the groom. The celebration vanished into complete silence. Even the wind seemed to disappear. Branko's smile slowly faded. For the first time that day, he looked afraid. Vukosava stopped only a few feet in front of him. Neither of them spoke. The entire village watched, waiting. Then, Vukosava quietly whispered 4 words that nobody standing there would ever forget. "Look at me, Branko." For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Branko stared at Vukosava as though he were looking at someone he no longer recognized. The courtyard was silent. Even the musicians stood frozen, their instruments hanging loosely at their sides. Nobody dared to interrupt. Vukosava took one slow step forward, then another. She stopped close enough that only Branko could hear her breathing. "Look at me." Her voice was calm, almost impossibly calm. Branko hesitated. Then he finally raised his eyes. For a brief moment, the two of them simply looked at each other. Years of lies, promises, secrets. Every memory seemed to exist inside that silence. When Vukosava spoke again, her voice trembled, not with anger, with heartbreak. "For 3 years, I believed every word you said. You promised me a future. You promised me a family. You promised I would never be alone." A tear rolled slowly down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "I waited for you. I defended you. I loved you." The last sentence barely escaped her lips. Several women in the crowd quietly lowered their heads. Some were already crying. No one looked at Branko anymore. They were looking at her. Because for the first time, everyone understood what those 3 years had meant. Branko finally spoke. His voice was cold. "You should leave." Nothing more. No apology, no regret, no attempt to deny what had happened. Only 4 words. "You should leave." Vukosava closed her eyes. For a moment, it seemed as though she might turn around, walk away, disappear forever. Instead, something inside her changed. When she opened her eyes again, the grief was gone. So were the tears. Her face had become completely still, almost peaceful. My great-grandfather would later say that this frightened him more than anything that happened afterward, because it no longer looked like a broken heart. It looked like acceptance. She slowly lifted her head and spoke loudly enough for every person in the courtyard to hear. "Then listen carefully." The silence became unbearable. "You chose this day, a sacred day, the day you promised another woman what you promised me." She took another step forward. "I will not curse your marriage. I will not curse your life." She paused. "I curse the lie. Several elderly villagers immediately crossed themselves. One old woman whispered, "Stop." But Vukosava continued, "You will have a son. He will grow into a good man. He will carry none of your sins." Her voice became even quieter. "And that is why he will pay for yours." Branko's face lost all color. "No." Vukosava never looked away from him. "On the day he is meant to begin his own life, he will walk to the old well. He will hear what I hear. He will see what I see. And no one will be able to stop him." For the first time all afternoon, fear spread through the crowd. Not because everyone believed her, because everyone suddenly remembered what day it was. Vidovdan, the old stories, the warnings their grandparents had repeated since childhood. Branko stepped toward her. "This is over." But before he could reach her, Vukosava quietly smiled, not with joy, with surrender. She slowly turned away from the wedding guests, walked through the silent crowd, and continued toward the old stone well standing just beyond the orchard. No one followed. No one understood what she was doing. Until she reached the edge, she rested one hand on the cold stones, looked down into the darkness, as though someone or something was waiting below. Then she whispered words that only the people standing closest later claimed to have heard. "I'll be waiting." She climbed onto the stone rim. Someone screamed. Branko finally began running. Too late. Vukosava looked back one final time. Not at the wedding guests, not at her family, only at Branko. Then, without another word, she stepped forward and disappeared into the darkness. The sound echoed from deep inside the well, a single, heavy impact. Then, nothing. No scream, no splash, nothing at all. For one impossible moment, the entire village stood frozen, listening, waiting, as though expecting the well to answer. The men finally climbed down into the well. It took nearly an hour before they recovered Vukosava's body. No one spoke while they carried her back to the surface. She looked peaceful, almost as if she had fallen asleep. There were no visible injuries, no expression of fear, only closed eyes, and a face that no longer seemed burdened by grief. The village priest refused to perform a proper funeral. Suicide, he said, was a grave sin. Some villagers agreed, others quietly protested. In the end, she was buried without the traditional prayers, without church bells, without a funeral procession. Only a handful of people attended. Branko never went. Neither did anyone from his family. My great-grandfather said that was the last time anyone openly spoke Vukosava's name for many years. People preferred silence. Silence was easier than remembering. The old stone well remained exactly where it had always been. No one sealed it. No one destroyed it. They simply stopped going near it. Children who once played there suddenly found new places to explore. Farmers took longer routes through the fields. Women collecting water chose wells much farther away. Nobody gave a reason. They simply avoided it, as though the village had reached an unspoken agreement. Leave it alone. Time, as it always does, kept moving. Seasons passed. Harvests came and went. The wedding became little more than an uncomfortable memory. Then, almost exactly 1 year later, Branko's wife gave birth to a son. They named him Pavle. My great-grandfather often said that holding the baby for the first time made him forget the curse. Pavle was healthy, strong, quiet. Nothing about him seemed unusual. Branko changed too. At least, That was how everyone remembered him. He stopped chasing women. He worked harder than ever. He spent every free moment with his family. Some villagers believed guilt had finally caught up with him. Others believed fear had. Either way, he was no longer the man Vukosava had loved, or the man who had betrayed her. Years slowly erased the sharp edges of the story. New children were born. Old neighbors passed away. The younger generation barely knew who Vukosava had been. Only the oldest villagers still lowered their voices whenever someone mentioned the old well. 23 years passed. By 1950, Pavle had grown into the kind of young man everyone respected. Hard-working, honest, kind. If there was one thing the entire village agreed on, it was this: he was nothing like his father. When Pavle announced that he was getting married, the village celebrated. Branko smiled for the first time in years. My great-grandfather smiled too. For a brief moment, it almost felt as though the past had finally lost its grip. Almost. A few nights before the wedding, Mihajlo woke unexpectedly. Later, he would never be able to explain why. No nightmare, no strange noise, just the overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. The house was silent. He walked to the window. Outside, the entire village lay asleep beneath a pale moon. Then he noticed someone walking across the fields, slowly, without a lantern, without hesitation. At first, he assumed it was a neighbor returning home late. Then he recognized the silhouette. Pavle. Something about the way he walked immediately felt unnatural. His pace never changed. His arms hung motionless at his sides. His head remained tilted slightly downward, as though he wasn't choosing where to go, but simply following a path he could already see. Mihajlo threw on his coat and hurried outside. "Pavle!" No response. He called again. Still nothing. The young man continued walking, straight toward the old well, when Mihajlo finally caught up to him. Pavle was already standing at the stone edge, looking into the darkness below, completely still. His eyes were open, but they weren't focused. They seemed fixed on something, deep inside the well. Something Mihajlo could not see. He grabbed Pavle's shoulder. The young man's skin was freezing cold, far colder than the night air. "Pavle!" Nothing, no reaction, no blink, no movement. It was as though he couldn't even hear his own name. Mihajlo shook him harder, still nothing. Only after another family member arrived and splashed cold water across Pavle's face did he suddenly gasp, as though waking from a deep sleep. He looked around in confusion. "What happened?" Mihajlo pointed toward the well. "Why did you come here?" Pavle frowned. "I didn't. I was asleep." The words sent a chill through everyone standing there, because every one of them had just watched him walk there with their own eyes. The following night, it happened again, only this time they weren't alone. As Mihajlo reached the well, he heard something. At first, he thought it was the wind moving through the stones. Then the sound came again, very faint, very slow, a whisper, coming from somewhere, deep beneath the water. The whisper came again, soft, barely audible. It wasn't loud enough to understand, only loud enough to know. It was there. Mihajlo slowly stepped closer to the stone well. The air around it felt strangely cold. Not the ordinary chill of a summer night. Something deeper. The kind of cold that settles beneath your skin. He looked down. Nothing. Only darkness. The moonlight reached a few feet below the stone rim before disappearing into blackness. "Pavle," he whispered, "do you hear it?" Pavle didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness below. Then, the whisper stopped. For one brief moment, everything became perfectly silent, even the insects, even the wind. Then came another sound, a slow, deliberate scratch, stone against stone. It echoed from somewhere deep below. Once, then again, long, uneven, as though something was slowly dragging its fingers across the ancient walls of the well. Mihajlo felt every hair on his arms stand up. He leaned farther over the edge, listening. The scratching stopped. Then, very quietly, he heard a woman's voice. Not clearly, only fragments, too faint to understand, but unmistakably, a woman's voice. He pulled Pavle backward. The young man suddenly blinked several times. His breathing became heavy. What happened? You don't remember? Pavle slowly shook his head. I was sleeping. Mihajlo never told him what he had heard. Not that night, not the next morning. He convinced himself there had to be an explanation, an echo, the wind, water moving beneath the stones, anything. The wedding preparations continued. No one wanted to speak about the well, especially not Branko. Whenever someone mentioned Vukosava's name, he immediately left the room. The day before the wedding, another strange thing happened. The village dogs refused to go near the old road leading toward the fields. Farmers tried pulling them by their collars. The animals resisted, whining, backing away. Some broke free and ran. By evening, everyone in the village had heard the stories. Children claimed they could hear someone crying during the night. An old woman swore she had seen a figure standing beside the well just before sunrise. Others dismissed everything as fear, nothing more. Fear spreads quickly in small villages, sometimes faster than truth. Then, the wedding morning arrived. The sun rose over the hills exactly as it had 23 years earlier. Hot, cloudless, unnaturally still. Several elderly villagers quietly noticed the resemblance. No one said it aloud, but everyone remembered. The musicians had barely begun playing when Mihajlo realized something. Pavle was gone. At first, he assumed the groom had stepped away to prepare. Minutes passed. No one had seen him. Branko called his name. No answer. Then someone shouted from outside the yard. He went toward the fields. Mihajlo didn't hesitate. He ran. Others followed behind him. They already knew where they were going. Nobody said the word. Nobody had to. The old well stood exactly where it always had. Silent. Waiting. Pavle was standing at its edge. His back faced the crowd. Completely motionless. Branko screamed, "Pavle!" The young man never turned around. He slowly raised one foot, as though preparing to climb onto the stone rim. Mihajlo ran harder than he ever had in his life. He was only a few steps away, close enough to reach him, close enough to save him. Then, Pavle quietly spoke. His voice sounded calm, almost peaceful. She isn't alone anymore. Every person behind Mihajlo stopped running. No one understood what he meant. Branko screamed again, "Pavle!" For the first time. The young man looked over his shoulder. His eyes were filled with tears. "I can hear her." Those were the last words anyone ever heard him speak. He turned back toward the darkness and stepped forward, without hesitation, without fear, without another sound. Several men jumped into the well within minutes. They pulled him out, but the water had already claimed him. Branko collapsed beside the old stones. He never spoke Vukosava's name again. Some villagers believed the curse had finally been fulfilled. Others insisted Pavle had suffered some unexplained illness. No investigation ever reached a definitive conclusion. No official report explained the voices, or the scratching, or why so many people claimed to hear them. But one thing remained undeniable. From the day Pavle died, the whispers stopped. The scratching never returned. And for the first time in more than 2 decades, the old well became completely silent again. The villagers buried Pavle only a few days later. No one celebrated another wedding that summer. The music stopped. The laughter disappeared. And for a long time, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. A week after the funeral, several men filled the old well with stones and earth, not because anyone believed it would end the curse, but because no one wanted to look into its darkness ever again. From that day forward, the whispers were never heard again. The scratching disappeared. The dogs stopped howling. Life slowly returned to normal. Or at least, that's what people tried to believe. My great-grandfather never claimed to know what truly happened. Neither did anyone else. Some believed Pavle had suffered from sleepwalking. Others blamed grief, fear, or the power of suggestion. But the oldest people in the village always told a different story. They believed Vukosava never cursed Branko. They believed she cursed his guilt. And guilt has a way of surviving much longer than the people who carry it. Even today, the exact location of the old well is known only to a handful of local families. Most refuse to speak about it, not because they fear the well itself, but because they fear remembering what happened there. Whether this case was the result of an ancient curse, a tragic coincidence, or something that still defies explanation, no one has ever been able to prove. Some details of this case are based on local accounts and stories that have been passed down through generations. Like many unexplained incidents, no definitive explanation has ever been confirmed. If unexplained cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to BB Blackbox. We'll open another case soon. Until then, some cases are never solved. They are only forgotten.